I was just a waiter, pouring coffee for a quiet old billionaire who ate dinner alone. I'd served him 3 or 4 times over the past few months, and I knew 2 things about him: that he was one of the richest men in the country, and that he was one of the loneliest, because you don't eat dinner by yourself every single week at a corner table, wanting no fuss and no conversation unless there's a hole in your life that money can't touch. The other times I'd served him, I'd noticed little things about him, the way you notice things about a quiet regular. He was unfailingly polite to the staff, which rich men often aren't. He always sat facing the door, and he'd watch people come in, every couple who walked through, every family with a kind of wistful attention, like he was looking for someone in every face. I thought it was just an old man's loneliness. I had no idea he was, quite literally, scanning every room he entered for a sister he'd lost 60 years ago, because after 6 decades of searching that had become simply how he moved through the world, always half-looking, everywhere, all the time. He tipped enormously and quietly, and never made a show of it. And he always ordered the same simple things, nothing fancy, the food of a man who'd been poor once and never forgot it. I liked him. I felt sorry for him without knowing why. And then, that night, I was refilling his coffee, and my hand was tired, and the cup was full, and I bumped the saucer, and a little wave of hot coffee sloshed over the rim and onto the cuff of his shirt. I started apologizing immediately, the way you do, reaching for napkins, mortified, because you do not spill coffee on a man who could buy the entire restaurant with what's in his wallet. And he waved off my apology, gracious, and he pulled back his cuff and pushed up his sleeve to keep the hot coffee off his skin. And that's when I saw it. On the inside of his forearm, just below the wrist, a small tattoo, crude, old, faded blue-black, obviously hand-done, not by any professional. A little bird, a sparrow, with one wing that came out crooked, like whoever made it had an unsteady hand. And my blood went cold, because I had seen that exact tattoo before, every day of my entire life, in the exact same spot on the exact same kind of arm. My mother has that tattoo, the same crude little sparrow with the same crooked wing in the same place on her forearm. I have looked at it 10,000 times. I know it the way you know your mother's voice, and here it was, 60 years older, on the arm of a billionaire in a $2,000 shirt I'd just spilled coffee on. I don't know why I said it. It wasn't professional, it wasn't smart, but my mouth was moving before my brain could stop it, and I leaned down close to him, and I whispered, "Sir, my mother has a tattoo just like yours, exactly like yours." The old man went completely still. He looked at me, not at the tattoo, at my face. He stared at my face like he was reading something written on it, and I watched the color drain out of his own face, and his hand, the one with the sparrow on it, began to tremble. And then, this billionaire, this old man worth more money than I could count in 10 lifetimes, slid out of his chair and went down onto his knees on the floor of the restaurant, right there between the tables, and he grabbed my hand with both of his shaking hands, and he looked up at me, and in a voice that was barely a voice at all, he said, "What is your mother's name?" I need to stop right here 10 seconds in, because to understand why a billionaire fell to his knees on a restaurant floor when a waiter mentioned his mother's tattoo, you have to understand what that little sparrow meant. And you have to understand the story my mother had told me my whole life about a brother she lost 60 years ago and never stopped looking for. That sparrow was not a decoration. It was a promise. It was made for exactly this moment, and neither of the 2 people who wore it had ever believed this moment would come. So if you have ever loved someone you lost and never stopped hoping, somewhere deep down, that the world was big enough and small enough to bring them back to you, then stay with me and go ahead and subscribe, because this is a story about a promise written in ink on 2 children's arms and the 60 years it took to keep it. Okay, let me back up and let me tell you about my mother and the sparrow and the brother. My name is Adrian Reyes. I'm 29 years old, and back then I was working as a waiter at an upscale restaurant, and I was not doing well. I want to be honest about that because it matters. I was barely making rent. I'd had some plans in life that hadn't worked out, some bad luck and some bad choices, and I was 29 and pouring coffee for rich people and wondering if this was just going to be my life. I was tired in the way you get tired when you've been struggling for a long time and you can't see it getting better. But I had my mother. Her name is Teresa, and she is, without any competition, the best person I have ever known. My mother raised me by herself. My father died when I was 8, and after that it was just her and me, and she worked herself to the bone, cleaning houses, working double shifts, doing whatever it took so that I would have a childhood. She never complained. She never made me feel poor, even though we were. She is one of those people who has been given very little by life and has responded by giving everything she has to the people she loves. I want to give you one picture of my mother, so she's a real person to you and not just a word. When I was a kid, maybe 10, we didn't have money for a birthday party, and I was upset about it, the way kids are. And my mother, who'd worked a double shift, came home exhausted, and instead of going to bed, she stayed up and she turned our tiny kitchen into a whole imaginary world. She made a cake from almost nothing. She strung up paper she'd cut into shapes. She invented games. And she made me feel, for one night, like the richest, most celebrated kid on earth, on a budget of maybe $4, running on no sleep because she could not give me things, but she could give me everything she had. That's my mother. A woman who was handed almost nothing and kept turning it into gold for the people she loved. Remember her because she's the heart of this. And my mother had a tattoo, that crude little sparrow with the crooked wing, on the inside of her forearm. And when I was a boy, I asked her about it, the way kids do, and she told me the story. And she told it to me again over the years, many times, because it was the most important story in her life, and it was a sad one, and I think telling it kept it alive. My mother was born into poverty, into a family that had almost nothing. And when she was 5 years old, and her older brother was 8, something terrible happened. Their parents died. I'll spare you the details because they're my family's and they're painful. But there was an accident. And in a single day, 2 small children were left with no mother and no father and no money, and no one who could take them. They had a grandmother, an old woman, already sick herself, already dying, and she could not take care of 2 young children, and there was no one else. So the state was going to take them. They were going to be sent to an orphanage, and my mother understood, even at 5, from the way the grown-ups were talking in low voices, that she and her brother might not get to stay together. That whoever took children took them one at a time, and that a little girl of 5 and a boy of 8 were probably not going to be kept together, because that's not how it worked. And the night before the people came to take them, their dying grandmother did something. She took a sewing needle, and she took ash and ink, and by candlelight, with her own shaking, sick, unsteady hands, she gave each of those 2 children a tattoo. The same one. A little sparrow, in the same spot on each of their arms, the inside of the left forearm, and her hands were so weak and shaking that the wing came out crooked, on both of them, the same crooked way, and she told them what it meant. She said, "The world is going to try to pull you 2 apart, and I can't stop it. I'm too old and too sick and too poor to stop it. But I can give you this. This little bird is on both of you now, forever, in the same place. And someday, no matter how much time goes by, no matter where you end up, if God is good, you will find each other again. And when you do, you might not recognize each other's faces. You might be grown, you might be old. But you will roll up your sleeve, and they will roll up theirs, and you will both have this same little bird, and you will know. You will know you found the one you lost. So keep it safe. Keep it your whole life. It's how you'll find your way home, to each other. The next day, the people came, and they took my mother, Teresa, and they took her brother, whose name was Thomas, and they were separated, just like she'd feared, sent to different places, and the machinery of the system swallowed them both. And here's the tragedy of it, the thing that kept them apart for 60 years. Thomas, the boy, was adopted. Young, by a family who wanted a son, and they were good to him, and they gave him a new life. But they also gave him a new name. Thomas, my mother's brother, stopped existing on paper. He became somebody else with a new first name and a new last name, and every record that connected him to a poor little boy named Thomas who'd lost his parents got sealed or buried or erased, the way adoption records were in those days. My mother was not adopted. A placement or 2 didn't work out, and she grew up in the system, in the orphanage and then in foster homes, and she aged out of it with nothing but the clothes she owned and a crooked little sparrow on her arm. She kept her name, Teresa, but a girl with no family and no money moves through the world and eventually marries and changes her name too and gets lost in her own way. So you had two people, a brother and a sister, both looking for each other across the decades and both looking for a person who no longer existed. My mother spent her whole life looking for a boy named Thomas with their old family last name, but there was no Thomas with that last name anymore. He'd been erased and rewritten. And her brother, wherever he was looking for a little girl named Teresa with that same old last name, but she'd married and changed hers, and moved again. They were both searching for ghosts, for names that had been dissolved by adoption and marriage and time. They could have walked past each other on the street and never known. My mother never stopped looking. I want you to understand that. Even with no money and no resources and no way to hire anyone, she never gave up on the idea that her brother was out there. When I was a boy, she'd have me help her write letters to agencies, to records offices, to anyone who might know something. She'd get her hopes up, and they'd get crushed, over and over. Every few years, she'd try again. The answer was always the same. Records sealed, no information available, we're sorry. And she would fold up the letter and put it away and go quiet for a few days, and then she'd get up and go back to work and keep living, because that's what she did. I remember one letter in particular, when I was about 12. She'd found some new agency, some new office that she thought might have records, and she'd saved up to send a certified request, which for us was real money. And we waited weeks. And I remember the day the response came, because she made me read it to her out loud. She said her eyes were tired, but really, I think she couldn't bear to read it herself. And I read the words, the same words as always, that the records were sealed and no information could be released. And I watched my mother's face while I read them, watched the hope she'd let herself feel just quietly, fold back up and get put away. And she said, Okay, that's all right, we'll try again another time. And she got up and started making dinner. She never let me see her cry over it. But that night I heard her through the wall, and it was the loneliest sound I've ever heard. And I lay in my bed at 12 years old and hated a world that would keep a woman from her own brother. She used to say to me, Adrian, I have a brother. I know it doesn't make sense to you because you've never met him, and I haven't seen him since I was 5. But I have a brother, and he's alive, I can feel it, and he has this same little bird on his arm, and one of these days, before I die, God is going to let me find him. I have to believe that. It's the thing I've believed my whole life. And I'd nod and hug her, and privately, God forgive me, I thought it was a beautiful, impossible dream. I thought her brother was probably dead or lost forever, and that this hope was just a kindness she did for herself. I never told her that, but I thought it. Now, the man at the corner table. That's where this turns. Because while my mother was cleaning houses and writing letters that came back sealed, her brother, it turned out, was becoming one of the wealthiest men in the country. His name, the name he had now, was Everett Vaughn. And if you followed business at all, you'd know the name, because Everett Vaughn had built an empire. He'd started with nothing, one small business decades ago, and through some combination of brilliance and relentlessness, he'd grown it into an enormous company, and then more companies until he was a billionaire many times over, the kind of self-made titan they write books about. But here is what the books about Everett Vaughn didn't say, what almost nobody knew, what I would only learn that night on my knees on a restaurant floor. Everett Vaughn had been born a poor boy named Thomas, who lost everything at 8 and was adopted away from a little sister he adored. And he had spent his entire adult life, and an enormous portion of his vast fortune, trying to find her. He had done everything money could do. Where my mother wrote letters that came back sealed, Everett Vaughn hired the best private investigators in the world. He hired firms that specialized in adoption searches, in finding missing people, in unsealing records. He spent, over the decades, what I later learned was millions of dollars, chasing every thread, every lead, every possibility of the little sister he'd lost. And he found nothing. Because he was looking for a girl named Teresa with an old last name, and that girl had grown up and married and vanished into a different name, into a hard and invisible life scrubbing other people's floors. All his money, All his investigators, all his power, and he could not find one poor woman who didn't want to be hidden, who was in fact looking for him just as hard, because the thread that connected them had been cut 60 years ago by adoption and never repaired, and it had hollowed him out. That's the thing I understood the first moment I really looked at him, before I knew any of this. This immensely wealthy man ate dinner alone every week because the one thing he had ever truly wanted, the one thing all his billions couldn't buy, was the sister he'd lost. He'd never married, I later learned, never had children of his own. He'd poured himself into building the fortune, maybe partly because he kept thinking the fortune would eventually be the thing that found her, that with enough money he could buy his way to her. And it never worked. And he'd gotten old, and he'd started to accept that he was going to die without ever finding her, without ever keeping the promise their grandmother made them make on both their arms. He carried that sparrow for 60 years. A billionaire, with a crude, hand-poked tattoo from a dying old woman in a poorhouse that he could have had removed or covered 1,000 times and never did, because it was the only thing he had left of her, and because it was the promise. Roll up your sleeve and they'll roll up theirs, and you'll know. And then a tired waiter spilled coffee on his cuff. So there we were. Him on his knees on the floor, both his shaking hands gripping mine, looking up at me, having just asked me my mother's name, and I said, "Teresa, her name is Teresa." And I watched something happen to his face that I've never seen happen to a human face before or since. It was like watching a man who'd been holding his breath for 60 years. Finally exhale. His whole body shook. But he wasn't done. He needed more. Because Teresa is a common enough name, and this man had had his hopes destroyed too many times over the decades to let himself believe on a first name alone. "Teresa," he repeated. "Teresa, the sparrow. Ask me. Ask me who gave it to her. Ask me where it is." And I understood what he was doing. He was testing it, the way you test a thing you're terrified to believe. "So," I said, "the tattoo is on the inside of her left forearm. A little sparrow with a crooked wing. She told me her grandmother gave it to her the night before they took her away, with a needle and ash, by candlelight. She told me the same little bird was put on her older brother's arm that same night, so that someday they could find each other." By the time I finished, Everett Vaughn was weeping. Not crying. Weeping, the way I imagine a person weeps maybe once in their life, from somewhere so deep it doesn't even sound human. Still on his knees, still holding my hand, and through it he managed to get out the words, "Her brother's name was Thomas. Thomas was my name. I am Thomas. Teresa is my sister. Teresa is my little sister. I have been looking for her for 60 years. The whole restaurant had stopped. Everyone was staring. Two men, one of them a billionaire in a fine suit and one of them a waiter in an apron, kneeling and standing on the floor between the tables, both of us now crying, holding on to each other like we were drowning. I didn't care. He didn't care. Nothing in that room existed except the sparrow in the 60 years and the impossible thing that was happening. "She's alive?" he asked me, and his voice broke completely on the word alive. "Teresa is alive? She's alive right now, tonight?" "She's alive," I said. "She's at home. She lives 20 minutes from here. She has that tattoo on her arm and she has told me about you my entire life. She never stopped looking for you. She always said she'd find you before she died. She said she could feel that you were alive." And this powerful old man, this titan of industry, put his face against my hand, against the back of my hand as I stood there, and he sobbed like a child, and he said over and over, "She kept looking, she kept looking, she kept looking for me too." What happened next is the part I'll carry with me until the day I die. I called my mother right there. I stepped away for a moment and I called her, and I could barely talk, and she thought something was wrong, thought I'd been in an accident because I was crying so hard, and I said, Mom, I need you to sit down. Are you sitting down? Mom, I found him. I found Thomas. I found your brother. He's here. He's real. He's alive, and he's standing right here, and he's been looking for you for 60 years, and I found him. The sparrow, Mom. I saw the sparrow." There was silence on the phone, a long, long silence. And then a sound came out of my mother that I had never heard her make in 29 years. A sound of pure disbelieving joy and grief all at once. the sound of a woman whose entire life's impossible hope had just come true in a single phone call, and she couldn't speak either. And Everett Thomas was reaching for the phone, his hands out, desperate, and I put the phone in his hand. And I watched a 68-year-old billionaire hold a phone to his ear and say, in a voice I can't describe, "Teresa? Teresa, it's me. It's Tommy. It's your brother. I'm here. I'm so sorry it took me so long. I never stopped. I promise you, I never stopped looking for you." I couldn't hear what my mother said back. I didn't need to. I could see it on his face. I keep coming back, in my mind, to how close it came to never happening. I almost called in sick that night. I'd picked up an extra shift I didn't want. If I'd stayed home, someone else serves that table. If I don't get tired and clumsy at that exact moment, the cuff never gets pulled back. If I'm 1 degree more professional, 1 degree more careful, I keep my mouth shut about a stranger's tattoo like any sane person would, and Everett Vaughn finishes his coffee and goes home alone, and my mother dies someday, still writing letters that come back sealed. The whole reunion of 2 people across 60 years hung on a tired waiter, an extra shift he resented, a shaky hand, and a few reckless words he had no business saying. I think about that, and I don't know whether to call it luck or something with a bigger name. My mother has no doubt what to call it. She says her grandmother and her God were patient, and they used a spilled cup of coffee because that's what happened to be handy. I've stopped arguing with her about it. After what I saw, I think she might be right. There's one thing Everett admitted to me later about that night that I think shows you who he really is under all the money. He told me that on the drive to my mother's apartment under all the joy, he was terrified. Not of anything you'd expect. He was afraid that after 60 years, she might be angry at him. That some part of her might have spent a lifetime believing he'd been adopted into an easy life and left her behind in the system, that he'd forgotten her, chosen a better family, abandoned his little sister. He'd built an empire and stared down the most powerful people alive without flinching, and the thing that had his hand shaking in the back of that car was the fear that his baby sister might have spent 60 years thinking he didn't love her anymore. He needed her to know he never chose to leave, that it was done to them. He'd been carrying that particular terror, it turned out, for most of his life. He didn't need to be afraid. The second she saw him, that was gone. But it tells you something, that a man who had everything was, at the end, just a big brother, scared his little sister might not know how much he'd loved her the whole time. They saw each other that night. It couldn't wait. Nothing on earth could have made it wait. Everett had his car bring us both to my mother's small apartment, this billionaire riding in the back of a beautiful car next to a waiter still in his work apron, and he was silent almost the whole way, staring out the window, his hands folded in his lap, and every so often he'd look down at the sparrow on his arm and touch it. And then we pulled up outside the modest little building where my mother has lived for 15 years, and she was standing outside on the sidewalk waiting because she couldn't bear to wait inside. A 64-year-old woman in her old cardigan under the streetlight, and Everett Vaughn saw her through the car window. I want to try to describe what happened when those 2 people saw each other, and I know I'm going to fail, because there aren't words big enough. The car stopped, and he got out, this old man, and my mother saw his face, and they both just stopped, frozen, 10 feet apart on a sidewalk, 2 old people looking at each other across 60 years. And I watched them both, at the exact same moment without a word, reach down and pull up the left sleeve of their arm, and there they were. 2 sparrows, the same crooked little bird, one on the arm of a woman who cleaned houses, one on the arm of a man worth billions, both put there by the same dying hand on the same candlelit night 60 years before, both kept safe across 2 entire lifetimes. Finally in the same place at the same time. And then they were in each other's arms, and they went down onto the sidewalk together, the 2 of them, holding each other, and they wept, and they held each other's faces, and they said each other's names over and over, Tommy and Teresa, Teresa and Tommy, the names 2 children had called each other before the world tore them apart. I stood back. This was theirs. I had spilled the coffee that found them, but this moment belonged to them, to a promise 60 years in the keeping, and I just stood on that sidewalk and cried and thanked God I'd been clumsy that night. Let me tell you where things are now. because I know that's what you want to know. My mother and her brother are inseparable. They are making up for 60 lost years as fast as two people in their 60s can, which is to say they talk every single day, and they see each other constantly. And my mother says the hole that was in her whole life, the one she'd learned to live around, is simply gone, filled in, like it was never there. She got her brother back. At 64, after a lifetime of loss and struggle, she got the one thing she'd wanted and never let herself fully believe she'd get. And I have to talk about the money because you're wondering, and because it would be strange not to. Yes, Everett is a billionaire, and he has folded my mother and me into his life completely, and our days of struggling are over. He bought my mother a beautiful home, and he tried to buy her 10 of them, and she had to tell him to slow down because my mother has never wanted much and doesn't know what to do with it all. He has made sure I will never pour another cup of coffee I don't want to pour. That part is real, and I won't pretend it isn't, and I'm grateful. But I need you to understand something, and it's the most important thing in this whole story. None of us care about that part. I mean it. If Everett Vaughn had turned out to be a poor man, if that sparrow had been on the arm of another waiter or a bus driver or a man with nothing, it would have been exactly as joyful, because what my mother got back was not a billionaire. What she got back was Tommy, her brother, the boy who held her hand when they were little and scared. The money is the least interesting thing about what happened that night, and if you made my mother choose between the fortune and her brother, she wouldn't even let you finish the sentence. He'd tell you the same. He spent 60 years and a piece of his fortune trying to find her precisely because the fortune was never the point. The fortune was just the thing he built while the real treasure was missing. There's something else, something Everett said to me a few weeks after all of it that I think about all the time. We were sitting, together, the three of us, at my mother's new kitchen table, and it was quiet and easy, the way it is now and out of nowhere. He took my hand, the same hand he'd grabbed on the restaurant floor, and he looked at it and he said, "You know, I could have died. I almost did die without finding her. I'm 68 years old. I'd started to make my peace with dying without keeping that promise. And it wasn't going to be my investigators that found her, or my money, or my power. In the end, it was a young man who spilled a cup of coffee and was brave enough, or foolish enough, to say something he had no business saying to a stranger. All my millions couldn't find my sister. And then my own nephew poured coffee on my sleeve. And he laughed, and then he cried a little, the way he does easily now, a man who spent 60 years not crying and is making up for that too. And he said, "Don't ever let anybody tell you that you're just a waiter. You're the man who brought my sister home to me. There is no amount of money that is worth what you did. You just didn't know you were doing it." And my mother, my beautiful mother, who cleaned houses for 30 years so I could have a life, who never stopped believing across 60 years of sealed letters, she gets to be happy now. That's the part that undoes me, if I'm honest. Not the houses, or the cars, or the end of my own struggling. It's that my mother, who deserved good things, and got so few of them for so long, is happy now. She has her brother, she has her son. The three of us have Sunday dinners, and my mother and Everett tell stories about a childhood they barely got to have, and they piece it together between them. Her memories and his, filling in the picture of two little kids and a poor house, and a grandmother who loved them enough to think of a way to bring them back together 60 years down the road. There's a small thing that happens at those Sunday dinners that gets me every time. At some point, usually when they're deep in some story about when they were little, my mother and Everett will be sitting next to each other, and without either of them seeming to notice they're doing it, they'll both have their left arms resting on the table, sleeves pushed up, and the two sparrows will be sitting there side by side on the tablecloth, a few inches apart. Two old birds finally roosting next to each other after 60 years apart. Nobody points it out, nobody has to. I just see it, the two matching marks resting together at last, and I have to blink and look at my plate, because it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Those two little crooked birds, home. That grandmother. I think about her more than anyone. A dying old woman, poor, sick, out of options, who could not save her grandchildren from being separated, who had no power at all in this world, and who still found a way, with a sewing needle and some ash and a steady enough faith, to reach across 60 years and 2 entire lifetimes and bring her family back together. She never got to see it. She died right after they were taken, but she did it. Her plan worked. It just took 60 years and a spilled cup of coffee. She's the real hero of this whole thing, an old woman nobody remembers, who loved her family so much she tattooed a way home onto their arms. Let me leave you with one thing, and then a question, because I really do read these. For 29 years, I thought I knew what my life was. I was a waiter who was struggling and stuck, the son of a house cleaner, a family of no importance that the world would never notice. And all of that was true, and none of it mattered, because the whole time we were carrying something the world couldn't see. A promise. A connection. A sparrow on my mother's arm that was one half of a miracle just waiting for its other half to walk into the room. You never know what you're carrying. You never know how close you are on any ordinary tired night to the thing that changes everything. My mother believed that for 60 years when it made no sense to believe it. She was right. She was right the whole time. So here's my question, and I'd genuinely like to know. Have you ever been reunited with someone you thought was lost forever? Or are you still hoping? Still carrying a sparrow of your own? Still believing that someday the world will bring your person back to you? Tell me about it. I read every single one, and after what I saw on that restaurant floor, I believe in that hope more than I believe in almost anything. And if this story meant something to you, do me one kindness before you go. Leave a comment, even a single word, so I know you stayed with me all the way to the end. And subscribe so the next story finds you when it comes, because they keep coming. And the next time you're pouring coffee, or riding a bus, or doing the smallest, most ordinary thing, remember that the person next to you might be carrying the other half of your whole life, and you just haven't spilled the coffee yet. Keep your eyes open. Keep hoping. Miracles are patient. Sometimes they wait 60 years, and then they show up wearing an apron.